covering today broad consent, the ethics and utility of broad consent. And as Peter mentioned, I'm Tom Doyle. I'm a PhD. And if you have any questions or want to reach out about anything that you want to continue the conversation today, I could be reached at the wonderful Doylet at iu.edu. I'm keeping it there. I'm keeping Doylet because it's so easy for people to remember. So let's jump right into it today. So pretty much why we talk about, to start the picture of broad consent, I think we really have to start with what informed consent is. So informed consent, as most folks will know, comes out of the Belmont Report. I mean, there's definitely a history of informed consent prior to the Belmont Report, but it really starts with this foundational document in bioethics called the Belmont Report, which was in response to the horrific and unethical experimentation at Tuskegee. Can't go into that today, but that's kind of where the impetus behind making informed consent into a rule of the law became a thing. And so in the Belmont Report, it says, respect for persons requires that subjects, to the degree in which they are capable, be given the opportunity to choose what shall or shall not happen to them, and this opportunity is provided when adequate standards for informed consent are satisfied. What are those standards? There's the information standard, so that includes telling participants what participation will entail, what the overall purpose of the project is, risks and benefits, etc. There's a comprehension standard, so you can't just present them with a bunch of jargon and say, hey, you want to do this, right? You have to present it in a way that they're going to understand, that they can really sink their teeth into and understand, like, yes, this sounds like something that I would want to be a part of and I want to agree to participate in. This comes through the reasonable person standard. So you need to present information in a way that a reasonable person could understand that information and make an informed choice about it. And then, of course, there has to be a voluntariness standard. So you can't make informed consent a part, you can't use coercion pretty much for informed consent. You can't say, in a clinical setting, if you're running a clinical trial, you can't say, well, you sign up for this clinical trial or I can't be your doctor, right? There can't be a coercive element and still have that be considered informed consent. So that's kind of just in general, most research that is not exempted by the IRB will be using informed consent as kind of stipulated in the Belmont Report and then clarified later on in the Common Rule, which we will get to right now. So the Common Rule is kind of the legal regulations from the Office of Human Research Protections about what needs to be accomplished before you can engage in human subjects research. So prior to what we call the revised Common Rule, which occurred in 2018, it stipulated that all non-exempt research involving human subjects must undergo an informed consent process that ensures potential participants are made aware of the purpose, risks, benefits of the study before agreeing to participate. And of course, their participation in the research is voluntary. They can, stop participating in the research at any time, so long as it's feasible, right? You can't wake up from the surgery and say, nope, not being a part of this, right? So it has to be, feasible that they can agree to no longer participate, but that needs to be, that option needs to be available for them. The informed consent process, of course, was not perfect, but at least could accommodate, for the most part, in the 1990s at least, everything that was in the scope of clinical trials, various kinds of behavioral research, and other sorts of human subject research involving an intervention, or a high-risk intervention. So anything that would be considered non-exempt from IRB review. But you may be thinking, it seems like with an informed consent, there is a glaring omission. It's broad consent. But, in the early 2000s, we entered the omics era of medical research. I still think that we're still in the omics era of medical research. And what that generally means is that we are looking at large data sets and a large amount of, biospecimens, biosamples, right? So a lot of human subject research that does omics-based research needs a huge amount of either biological materials or genetic materials or various types of data that is unfeasible really for any omics researcher to get by themselves. And so Ultimately, what started happening is these things called biorepositories started propping up. Things like biobanks started to become really a big thing in the early 2000s and still are a big thing even to today. They are kind of the foundational infrastructure for most medical research that occurs. Certainly, all of the omics research or translational science research that occurs usually uses a biobank. Um, and so we saw ultimately that the model of informed consensus is really the problem, and why broad consent is something that we talk about is the model of informed consent, which is stipulated, of course, in the pre-2008 Common Rule, seemed to be stretched thin by the idea of what a biobank is. So what a biobank is a person submits or donates a sample to a biobank, which itself is considered a research project. And when they submit the sample, they're told, usually, like the biobank collects your sample, it stores it, and then it gives it to future research projects. Well, in informed consent, right, if you agree to a research project, you need to know what about the research project you're agreeing to, right? You need to know about the procedure, the purpose, the risks and the benefits. If you're signing up for a biobank, your sample could be used for a research project that hasn't even been thought of yet. So it seems like there is a tension between informed consent and the concept of biobanking or the concept of using samples collected for secondary unspecified research usage. So to state this problem more clearly, informed consent stipulates that the potential participants must be informed about the overall purpose of the research, the specific procedures, and the anticipated risk and benefits, if there are any. All of this requires a quite specific research protocol to already have been developed. Biobanking and the compiling of large omics-based data sets, so like genomics, requires the collecting of biospecimens and identifiable information for a future unspecified research project. So you can't inform participants about projects that haven't even been envisioned yet. You can't tell the future. You can't say like 10 years down the road, a researcher is going to walk into this door and ask to do this with your sample, right? And so there is a bit of a tension with being able to inform participants in a biobank or inform participants who you're collecting data for secondary usage, what that usage eventually will turn out to be. We ran a public deliberation event, which I'm not going to get into because that will take us down a completely different route. But ultimately, what it was lay individuals gave us their thoughts and opinions about biobank. And I always remember one of the participants came to us. They have like a week before, they have like a week break after they learn a bunch about biobanking. They came back, and one woman, one deliberant said that she was struck by how biobanking is not workable with informed consent. She had actually went and researched a little bit about biobanks, about consent, about ethics, and she's like, doesn't seem like a biobank can do informed consent. I was like, you've got it. You figured it out. So the solution that's been proposed and that has been working for the most part has been broad consent. So to accommodate biobanks and biorepositories and the associated omics research, the notion of broad consent was brought into the world of research ethics. I tried to narrow down just for my own kind of nerdy interest when exactly broad consent was officially a term. I found that some of the earliest instances, at least from the NIH perspective, is in 2014, the NIH genomic data sharing policy stated that it expects investigators generating genomic data to seek consent from participants for future research uses and the broadest possible sharing. So by 2014, the NIH was already aware of the fact that they needed to move into broad consent. They needed to have broad consent be something that was available. And just kind of a definition of broad consent, if it's helpful, is a participant may give permission for their biological sample and or leftover tissue and or data to be used for an unspecified future-oriented research program or use. There's going to be, of course, additional criteria that need to be obtained in order to do broad consent. But just generally, the idea of broad consent is a participant can say, I'm giving you permission to use this for future unspecified research. So the way that broad consent, sometimes if you just Google broad consent or try to figure out does my research study require broad consent, you'll find the discussion of broad consent within the revised Common Rule. So by 2008, there was already a growing body of literature stipulating that broad consent is needed to accommodate the Ellman's era. We already knew 2014, probably earlier than that, that we needed to move into broad consent. The common rule was revisited and revised in 2008 to address the changing human subjects research landscape. It needed to be updated because a lot of stuff happened since 1991. In terms of broad consent, this meant the addition of the following line, which you can find in the just the general overview of consent in the revised common rule. It says broad consent may be obtained in lieu of informed consent obtained in accordance with, there's of course paragraphs, with respect to the storage, maintenance, and secondary research usage of identifiable private information and identifiable biospecimens. And I think this language almost sounds like it's directly, for biobanks or data banks or repositories. But broad consent also can be applied to, researchers who have clinical trials, to other types of research that do involve just like having samples, leftover tissue that could be used for future research purposes. And you might think to yourself, maybe I should, create a biorepository, at least have a way to store that data or use it for future research usage. So I think this language is like very particular to biobanks, but I think it's also applicable to other types of research projects. And to put simply about the revised common rule, there's a new, I will get to this later, way to do consent that's in accordance with the OHRP guidelines. And pretty much the Office of Human Research Protections wanted to say that you can do broad consent. You don't have to worry about anything, any of the ethics or regulatory issues, rather, with incorporating broad consent. It's now in the law. You can follow it. You can work with the IRB to make sure you're following broad consent. The question is, do you want to do broad consent? So let's just get into what the actual stipulations for doing broad consent via the revised common rule says. So if you wanted to look it up, you can just enter in, of course, the entire section right here will bring you right to the paragraph on broad consent, but I'll fill you in on what it says. So it has some of the same elements for informed consent. So you have to meet, the basis of what you would say during informed consent. So the collection procedure, data protections, risk and benefits, you have to do that. The second thing that you need to do is provide a general descriptions of the types of research that could be conducted on biospecimens. So if you're doing cancer research, you have to specify that your biospecimen will be used for cancer research. Or if you know a particular disease, you might be able to say that. You would have to include what types of biospecimens and information might be used and how they might be shared. So providing some information to donors or to participants at the time of their giving you that sample, how you plan on sharing that sample. What do you plan on doing with it after you've got it kind of stored away? How long the information and biospecimens will be stored. You can say indefinitely, that's a possibility for you. Some of the statements indicating that participants will not be informed about their samples to be used unless they agree to receive this information. Then a stipulation that they will not receive results from studies, and then information about who to contact for any and all information pertaining to the study. So it's pretty much, in my mind, it is a lot of the informed consent with a lot of extra features added to it to kind of accommodate some of the concerns that folks might have about biobanking or about about storing biosamples or information for future research usage. Now, the question is, what was happening prior to 2018, right? Because it's not as if 2018 happened and then biobanks were all of a sudden, popped into existence, right? Biobanks have been a thing for quite a while prior to 2018. So what biobanks and what most projects that were doing secondary research usage were doing was just doing either they were getting waivers of consent because we'll get into this later, but it could be the fact that it's a minimal risk study, it's unfeasible to do the research in any other way. There are all of the other criteria that go into a waiver of consent, but for the most part, another way that you can do broad consent is just doing the informed consent process. So, right, a biobank as a research project can stipulate that the purpose of the biobank is to store samples for future research usage. You can tell somebody this is the purpose of this project, is to keep samples around for other researchers to use later on. so they can be informed of this purpose. The procedure was, of course, sample collection and the potential. And you can talk about, what that includes, what it looks like to be a part of a biobank, right? You can put that in an informed consent document, and then you can also discuss the risk and benefits of being a part of a biobank. Your data will be shared across, to different types of researchers. There's always, you can, de-identification is not perfect, right? You can include all the things that come with, just generally being a part of a biobank, what those risks include. So in short, biobanks were just doing informed consent. In fact, you can still be a biobank and do consent in the informed consent way prior to the, in the pre-revised, 2008 Common Rule standards, right? You don't have to do broad consent in the way that the Common Rule stipulates in order to collect and store research samples, right? That's just an option that is given to you. Speaking of options, so the way that the OHRP kind of describes broad consent and why they even, brought broad consent into the new Common Rule was because they wanted to give another option for researchers or institutions that were doing this type of secondary use research. It's important to realize that you are not required to do broad consent if you're doing secondary use research. It's not as if you're doing secondary use research, you have to default to the Common Rule, to the revised Common Rule's broad consent standard. So what are the options available for you? Well, you can do broad consent, right? You can do that. You can do traditional informed consent if it's possible. You can do a waiver of consent. This would require you to probably look more into if your study or your storage of the samples qualifies as could qualify for a waiver of consent, and that option is available for you to read more on in the rules itself, and also IRBs can. Various IRB pages can tell you more about waivers of consent, and you can also apply for an alteration of consent. So that's doing pretty much just traditional informed consent with a few changes to accommodate your study, provided that the IRB approves those alterations. So you might be asking yourself, which of these options is most useful? I'm sorry to tell you, but it's going to depend on the context, right? There really is no one-size-fits-all approach to broad consent, and I think this is why the OHRP kind of talks about broad consent and how they talk about it in the revised Common Rule as just being an option, right? Because they don't want to tell you have to do it in this way, right? Sometimes it doesn't make sense to do broad consent in the way that they stipulate, the way that they are giving you for broad consent. And so it depends, right? You'd have to think about your study. You'd have to think about the particular context of your study, the situation. Is there a way to de-identify the data? Things of that sort. As Peter had mentioned, BSAP is here to help. I've put the, IU Center for Bioethics webpage. You can just go to the Center for Bioethics webpage, go to the Research Ethics tab, and request a consult, right? If you want more information about, what would be the more useful way to approach broad consent, we are here to help. So, I of course got a PhD in ethics. I did all this IRB stuff, but I want to get into a little bit of the ethics side of broad consent. So, of course, broad consent comes about from the omics era, but what does generally, from the ethics standpoint, what does it mean? What is broad consent doing? So the ethics of informed consent generally revolves around the notion of autonomy, which generally gets distilled down to the idea that individuals can and should make their own decisions about their health or what's done to their bodies or whether they want to participate in research. And I think we can distinguish autonomy versus permission and the ethics of autonomy versus the ethics of permission. So biobanks don't contact participants every time their samples are being used and asked in the very autonomous way, do you want your biospecimen to be used for this project, right? So rather what a participant is doing when they are agreeing to a biobank is pretty much giving the biobank permission to use your sample. You've donated a sample to them, and so the biobank has permission to use that in a way that fulfills the mission of the biobank that was told to the participant at the time. And I think the ethics of permission, unlike the ethics of autonomy and the ethics of informed consent, has to or revolves around the notion of trust. So let's look at an analogy here. So donation. So we often say that when we give money to a charity or community group, but really what we mean is what we mean by that when we give money to a community or charity group is that we are giving permission for the charity or group to use our money in a way that fulfills the mission of that charity or group. We do this because it saves us the burden of having to take it upon ourselves to figure out who is in need of our communities and decipher what resources, programs, or assistance are required to address these needs. And so, in the same way that a biobank or a researcher might keep a sample around for secondary usage, right? You are donating a sample to them because it saves you the time of having, it saves the researchers the time of having to find you and you trying to find researchers and say, I want to participate in this project. I want to advance medical research. So you are just donating a sample to somebody else who's able to broker that relationship between you and future research projects. So, but by giving our money or by giving our biosamples, right, we place trust in that charity or group that fulfills that mission. We don't expect the charity slash group to ask us every time or every other day, is it okay if we use this money to buy baby formula, right? So we place a lot of trust in a charity or group or a biobank to fulfill the mission to use our samples in a responsive way in a trustworthy manner. So what is considered ethical then depends on if this charity or group is acting in a manner that is deserving of our trust. Are they fulfilling the mission? Are they making the most of what they've been given? Are they making an impact on the community? So ultimately, as you can probably tell, I think that broad consent operates on relatively the same ethical concern for trust. The ethics of broad consent is less about asking every person who provides samples and data, is it okay if I do this? Rather, it's about making sure that researchers and institutions who are utilizing broad consent act in a manner that is worthy of trust. So making sure that they're doing things that maintain trustworthiness. So what does it mean to do trustworthy broad consent? Since participants are giving researchers and institutions permission to use their biosample, they must act in a way that's trustworthy. I've come up with, these are not all of the questions that you might ask if you're a researcher doing broad consent or operationalizing broad consent, but you might ask yourself, are the biospecimens and data being used in a manner that is consistent with the overarching mission, right? Are you doing the research that the participants who gave you the samples thought that you were doing, right? Are you doing cancer research? Are you furthering drug discovery? Are you doing the thing that you said that you would be doing with those samples? Is there consistent, well-maintained documentation that indicates when and why certain key decisions were made regarding collecting, sharing, or storage? So just relatively maintaining a good documentation base so that you can have some indication of why you made the decisions that you did. Are there efforts to be transparent about research operations? So what kinds of projects, samples, and data are being shared with, key publication, drastic deviations in operations, et cetera? And is there a way to gather community feedback from participants to ensure that they're also involved in some of the decision making, such as community advisory boards? So those are just some questions to think about and ask yourself if you are doing secondary use research about how you can maintain a trustworthy broad consent environment, let's say. I would like to leave you all with a couple of models of broad consent and my kind of thoughts on them, because if you Google broad consent, you'll find these three models. There is general broad consent, which is kind of the way that most biobanks operate. You have a one-time, you approach a donor one time and tell them, do you give us permission, or would you donate a sample to us that we can then use for medical research, right? Do kind of the traditional informed consent process about what it means to be a part of a biobank. And then that's it, really. So this is, easy to implement and maintain. It just requires, probably finding a good consenter, somebody who can describe the biobank to certain individuals. But I would say that there is definitely a heavier burden placed on trustworthiness then, because then donors usually do not have kind of any interaction with the biobank after that. So there's a heavy focus on maintaining, acting. There's a heavy focus on making sure that the biobank or the researcher who's doing secondary use research is acting in a trustworthy manner. There is tiered consent, so that is pretty much giving participants the ability to opt into certain types of research. So if you are at a cancer biobank, for example, a donor might be able to say, like, I want my sample to be used for all cancer research. I want it to be used only for blood cancer research. I want it to be used only for leukemia research, right? So you're giving folks the option at the time of consent where they want their samples to be used. Of course, there's a more administrative burden. You then have to track to make sure that the samples are being used, not for just general cancer research. Then if they selected leukemia research, yeah, make sure that's only going to leukemia research, right? So there's more of an administrative burden, and actually I think raises probably some issues then with trustworthiness if you're not using samples in the right way. And I would say that while it does afford participants more of a choice, I definitely do think, like, definitely operating the biobank still in a trustworthy manner, or secondary operating in a trustworthy manner is, pretty important, even in tiered consent. Dynamic consent is, I would say, probably the least likely to occur for most research projects, but it pretty much involves creating a research kind of platform, usually an online portal where folks can actually go in, participants can go in and select either, usually it's actually opt out where you are, sorry, it's opt in. So you are opted into all research projects, but you can go into the portal and select specific research projects that maybe you don't want to opt into, so you can opt out of those. Another way is, folks can go in and they just select which studies they want to opt in. So they have to constantly sign into the portal and decide what studies they want to be a part of. As you can imagine, heavy administrative burdens and upkeep costs. You have to, constantly be tracking samples. There's a lot of things that make, I think, dynamic consent at this point pretty unfeasible. But it definitely is out there as an option. I would say that participants, of course, have more direct control. It's kind of a way for participants, or for some biobanks, or for some secondary use research, to still maintain that autonomous choice that has kind of become the foundation of our bioethics environment. Trustworthiness is still there, because you are storing, of course, the samples. You still need to operate in a trustworthy manner, but it has become, I would say, is less of a concern. So I've run through a lot, and I imagine there will be questions, and that's great because we have 25 minutes for questions. So I will leave it at that and open the floor for people to ask any and all questions.
I can ask you questions all day, so people here should take the opportunity. Terrific introduction, Tom. Definitely raising how complicated this area is and the advances.
Yeah.
I see Andrew has come on camera and off mute, so he is ready to talk, I think.
I'll jump in with a question if nobody else is ready to go. Thank you, Tom. You raised some questions in a way that I hadn't exactly thought about, so that's good. Get my brain thinking about this issue. One first thing that came up was when you use the term research in this context of biobanks, does that automatically, or are there constraints in the common rule that exclude research that could lead to intellectual property that could become commercialized and generate funding for future research, as sometimes happens? What are the regulations around research projects that could generate intellectual property? Do you know?
I would say off the top of my head, I don't think I've come across very many things in the OHRP as far as I can tell. I mean, of course, if you're doing informed consenting and you're creating a product with the research, then that usually is included. But with biobanking, that is I don't think I know the answer to it, but it's a good question. I would imagine there is kind of no uh, there is no, I think, burden on the biobank to have to report that your sample may be going towards intellectual property. I don't think a biobank is required to disclose that, whether they use the broad consent model or whether they use the informed consent model. So that is definitely that. Yeah, I don't think the OHRP requires, or there's anything in the regulations that actually requires biobanks to report that out to participants. I mean, they will say, I mean, definitely biobanks will usually put in that they do work with for-profit partners, but yeah.
As usual, we have this dance between regulation and knowing the details of what we have to do, and also the ethics. And so, Andrew,
Mhm.
question, because one of the issues that comes up with, again, Tom, you're a supporter, it appears, of broad consent as long as people behave trustworthy in a trustworthy way. And Andrew, you're raising the issue of profit, and is it still trustworthy when someone gives a sample and other people are making billions of dollars on it? Does that seem very trustworthy? So why don't we stay there and stay away from the regulation right now? I think regulation-wise, there's no limit on that, but ethics-wise, there might be. And we certainly saw this in our deliberation, and anybody on this call who's thinking about doing broad consent would think about it. But if you're going to patent something based on a sample, boy, how does this donor feel? Now, many people who don't know much about research ethics, and many people who do, go back to the eternal life of
Henrietta
Henrietta
Lacks.
Lacks.
yeah,
Yeah.
I could lose my license as bioethicist for stumbling on her name, but that because it seems so wrong, right? That her cells made a lot of people so much money and she got nothing. And there are other cases, famous cases, which we could talk about. We probably don't have quite enough time of people who have very unique cells that then gave others a product to sell. Is that, Andrew, do you feel strongly? We actually saw a lot about this in the public deliberation. People very uncomfortable with a biobank taking samples and having some people make a lot of money and the donors getting nothing. Not quite the kind of unique cell situation of Henrietta Lacks or John Morgan. Is that his last name? John, Jane Hartsock, if she's on, is going to correct me. On the other famous case of a sample that made people a lot of money. How do you?
Yeah, sure. I mean, just the fact that a lot of cancer research is headed toward drug discovery, or other kinds of research heads towards drug discovery, which could be very profitable. I think it came up in my mind because, Tom, you first told us, biobanks collecting data, collecting samples, storing it, or data from omics, wasn't consistent with informed consent. And then you said, well, there's this form of informed consent that they're doing. I really wished you'd said, well, there's a quasi-informed consent, if you'd given it a different name, because yeah, I could very much see the trick that I'm going to call it a trick. The idea of saying, well, our research project is to collect and store under certain constraints your samples. People could give consent to that, but then sharing it, I feel like that falls into a whole nother, who am I giving it to? And would I give it to a pharmaceutical company who's going to go off and make $10 billion on your sample? Or maybe it would be I don't want to pick on pharmaceuticals, but some other sharing that would not be appropriate. So the tiered options of broad consents and the dynamic options seem to address that. But this idea that you came up with, that the biobanks, or that you reported the biobanks were doing informed consent, doesn't really, to me, come to the level of common rule of informed consent. So that's why I talked about this IP component.
Yeah, and I think that, I mean, I will say that I think that that sentiment is shared, and I do think that's why the OHRP tried to move into the actually putting the broad consent stipulation into the revised common rule.
But you said it wasn't a stipulation, it's
it
just
isn't
an option.
it is an option, so it's not a requirement.
It's not a
Yeah,
stipulation, it's not a
yeah,
requirement. So that
yeah,
sort of seems squishy to me, ethically.
yeah. Yeah, I think that is still a concern. I mean, I think a lot of people are I don't actually know if a lot of people use the broad consent option if they're doing secondary use research. They're not usually using that. They're going with the informed consent option or trying to get a waiver of consent or finding a way to get a waiver of consent so they don't have to kind of worry maybe about the informed consent option. So I will say that I mean, honestly, from my opinion, there are definitely holes in the regulation as far as, there are concerns about, what happens, across the life of a biobank sample. Where does it end up? How does it get shared? And do donors know where it's being shared? So yeah, I do agree with you that that is definitely hole in the regulations. And I will say, I think I always try to, like, when I talk about informed consent, like they're just doing traditional informed consent. I do think there needs to be scare quotes around informed consent, because it's informed consent maybe to regulators, but from the ethics standpoint, I don't know if that meets the standards or the spirit, let's say, of what informed consent is really supposed to be doing.
Colin,
Yeah, I
I
saw
wanted to hear what you had to say.
Colin's hand was up.
Um, so it's, I think, not as meaningful after all the rest of this conversation. But one thing that I've heard Peter say plenty that I think is really relevant to stress, especially for an audience who might be interested in trying to implement some of the stuff that Dr. Doyle was talking about, which is there is certainly a policy debate and an ethics debate related to disclosure of things like intellectual property and the generation of profit from donated materials. But I'd add also that there's the whether or not you feel like this is actually a conflict of interest, that this might have some kind of um, ulterior motivation that it supplies to the researchers. The appearance of that conflict is also relevant, especially thinking about recruitment, retention of participants over the long term. So I would also add that for people who are considering what types of consent they should be using as well, or how to formulate their consents.
Yeah. If I can jump in, I really appreciate that insight because I think I was going along those lines as well. This idea that, um, Tom, you brought up the idea of it's like donating to a charity. Well, charities often, to keep their donor um, their reputation with donors and and continuing to grow their donor pool, report regularly on what they're doing with money and give people feedback on this. And if it just is a donation of tissue and nobody ever gets contacted again, then the reputation and the possibility if things get out could really restrict donations. I'd also like to challenge you to think about, if I'm giving a donation one time to a charity, that might be different than giving a sample that could be used over and over. It's maybe a little bit more like giving them access to my bank account and saying, yeah, sure, we trust you to
Right.
take out money whenever you need a donation for something. It seems a little more
Right.
complex than just here's a check for $100.
Yeah, so it's more of the wealthy donor who donates the $4,000 every year to some
Well, it's about
yeah,
access ongoing to a lot of
right.
different things, and that is a challenge. So I appreciate the work that Peter, you've done, and all of you, Tom and Colin, all who involved with the public deliberation. This seems like a critical place for this work to go forward.
Yeah, I love these comments. Actually, Tom, why don't you just take down the slides until we need them again, so we can see each other's stuff.
Yeah.
No, take down the whole sharing. Yeah. The issue of trustworthiness, and I was just saying to stop sharing, Tom.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out where that button is on my screen. Okay, it's over there. All the way over there.
Oh, there are maybe video cameras on, so I'm just seeing other names. So I'm not sure what that actually accomplishes, but it's something. But look, I agree with what's been said, Colin and Andrew, and Nick also in your I'm sorry, Tom, in your talk. It's like it is legal. It is following the regulations. There's actually something in the informed consent for the biobank. I was trying to call it up here. I couldn't quite put my hands on it, which says like if there's money made, you're not getting any. And if we find out something about your health, we're not going to tell you, or we probably won't tell you. So it's like what we told them. and it's legal, just like those disclosures on you when you downloaded that app last night were legal, and now you can't sue. But what is the actual relationship, and is the donation? I love the I must say I love the donating to a charity model, and I love your twisting that, Andrew, into where they're going into your biobank, they're going into your biobank, into your real bank every
Yeah.
month, more money, and not telling you because that's what they're doing with your data, right? They're going and getting data about you every month. They're not getting more samples from you unless maybe it's leftover samples like money you threw on the street, right? So not going and getting a new blood draw, but getting so that's a fascinating way to extend that metaphor, which I find it very reassuring, the charity metaphor. But I agree with you, Andrew. It could be taken in different directions.
Yeah, I mean it is like a brokerage, like a stock broker. I mean, you're giving them money every other quarter, and they're using the money that you've made, and they're using it again. So, and that I mean that relationship is built on trust. I mean, similarly, so you have to be able. I mean, if your broker, if your agency is acting in a trustworthy manner, you feel less likely to be ill at ease with the fact that you've given them your money, that you've given them your sample, and I will stipulate in the time that there's definitely a distinction between being trustworthy and just trying to, con people into getting their trust, right? Their trustworthiness is actually acting in a way that is, worthy of trust, right? You have to be worthy of trust and yeah.
So Tom won't brag for himself, but we're running a project now, NIH funded bioethics project to create websites for two of our local biobanks, for donors to learn more about what's going on, where their samples were used, private public partnerships, changes in consent or enrollments to try this out because many biobanks, one, are afraid to tell because they're afraid they're going to lose their donors. They'll withdraw their samples, which is their right. And secondly, it's expensive. It's hard to do. So we're trying to make a model that's easy to implement to try to actually move forward in this model of biobanking to make it more trustworthy and perhaps address issues of distrust. So that I would say they should be telling people when they have the next breakthrough that is the next GLP-1 that's going to make $1 trillion for IU School of Medicine, Lilly. They should be told. If they don't like it, they should get their sample out. If they do like it and say, hey, you know what? I made a contribution. I'm glad that, these things are happening. It's a transparency issue. And our deliberants pushed us on that. And so we're following their lead on that. Okay, at the 10-minute mark, as in the NFL in the 2-minute mark, we have a timeout for other people who have not spoken. See, I went to the Colts game for Sunday. We have timeout for other people who have not spoken to weigh in. Andrew, Colin, and I, and certainly Tom will talk all day about this, and then we'll go through the night into tomorrow. But anybody else on the call? There's a question. There's no dumb question. We on this who've been talking a lot, live with these topics a lot. We would like to have any other question. Perhaps somebody watching this recording might want to hear what you were asking. Or not. That's okay too. Yeah. Okay, well, that gets us back to Colin, Andrew, and me. Meg, anybody, any questions? I know, Meg, you've got thoughts, but you're gonna be quiet today, I guess. So, okay. And one of these phones is a group of people, I think, listening. So, okay. Tom, do you want to wrap up with anything? Any last thoughts? I do think that what you described about the range of ways to succeed in getting open consent, sort of broad consent, is fascinating. I love Andrew's point that adding another way to get broad consent that's more strictly delineated is by definition going to be ineffectual unless you close off the other ones, right? You've
Mhm.
added a well-regulated, well-defined way to get broad consent, and you leave open the loopholes people have been using. Well, they're going to keep using the loopholes. And to be honest, I will guide researchers who come here about how to use those loopholes in a trustworthy way and adequately. Because the broad consent rule that came with the new common rule in 2018 is a little more restrictive, and I don't think there's anything. I think you can do the other ways ethically, and so usually the bioethics group will help people do that. So, anyway, any final thoughts, Tom, before we wrap up?
I don't think so. I think I've covered a lot. I will say definitely broad consent is, I would just say that the ethics outpace the regulations. So the regulations will be the regulations, and what is regulatorily approved is different from, operating a biobank or a biorepository or doing secondary use research in a trustworthy manner. And so I do think that if, the future researchers, many years who are watching this, watching this recording, you have to maintain trustworthiness with your donors and act in a way that is responsible and respectful of the folks who have given you their information and biosamples. So those are my final words, unless there's any questions.